Radio presents its broadcast schedule in partnership with
Indigo Books, Music, and Cafe. Indigo, a virtual department store for book lovers. Your direct line to the books and culture makers of today. Online at indigo.ca.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Steve Paikin. Paula Todd's on assignment tonight. We welcome you to this Tuesday edition of Studio 2. The Civil War in Sudan. Is a Canadian oil company taking sides?
I think they can be good corporate citizens if they do what we are suggesting they do.
There's no doubt that the champagne corks will be popping in Talisman's boardroom today and in the boardrooms of the government of Sudan. It's that time of year again.
After 40 years in mutual funds, there's one thing we realize. Eventually, everyone retires.
The RSP season. What's new and profitable? And the Chinese boat people dividing Ontario's Chinese community.
They were not forced to take the voyage. They willingly paid the money, or at least paid a down payment, and agreed to work off the balance.
It's also important for Canadians to start paying more attention to the situation in China and start questioning why is it that people want to leave that country.
Sudan, in the heart of Africa. It's a story of oil profits, slavery, and a savage civil war. Yesterday, a special fact-finding mission reported that Canada's largest independent oil company, Talisman Energy of Calgary, which has oil drilling operations in Sudan, is, in effect, helping Sudan's government suppress a rebellion. But Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy, who commissioned the report, has decided not to impose sanctions on Talisman. That decision has disappointed human rights groups and earned Canada a sharp rebuke from the U.S. State Department. With us tonight, Georgette Gagnon, an independent human rights field investigator and a member of the government's fact-finding mission to Sudan. And in Ottawa, Senator Lois Wilson, the Foreign Minister's special envoy to the Sudan peace process. You were, Georgette, as we suggested, a key member of this team that was over there in December investigating what was going on at the minister's behest.
Yes.
What's Talisman doing in Sudan specifically that you believe is contributing to the government side in this war effort?
Well, some of its infrastructure, such as an airstrip, is being used by the government of Sudan to attack civilians who live in and around the oil fields. And the purpose of these attacks is to displace them and clear them out of the oil-producing areas. Of course, it must be realized that these civilians are considered the enemy in the eyes of the government of Sudan because they're Southerners. And so they are seen to be supporters of the other side in the Civil War.
Senator Wilson, you're not part of this John Harker team that went over to Sudan, but you are the minister's special envoy for the area. Do you support the conclusions that this report, which Madame Gagnon helped write, do you support those conclusions?
I didn't do the investigation, so I'm not sure if I support them or not. What I do support are many of the minister's responses to those recommendations, one of which is that we'll use the IMF and the UN and the World Bank to monitor how the profits from the oil are used.
All right, let me just back up for a second then. The airport, I understand. Are there any other things that the government is doing?
Well, Senator Wilson raised the issue of the oil revenues, and that certainly is another way that many people think that Talisman is contributing to the Civil War. The revenue from oil production is the argument is it's being used to fuel the war and to actually allow the government to fight its war, buy better weapons, better tanks, that sort of thing.
You talked to Talisman about this?
Yes, we did. We spent 3 days with Talisman at their oil production site, and we learned from them that in fact they did know that their airstrip was being used by the government of Sudan for military purposes.
And you told them what you thought about what they were doing. What did they say to you?
They said that they had told the government of Sudan to stop that, and that it had, and that the government started again, and they told them to stop, and that was the last that we heard of it. However, I know that Minister Axworthy has written to the government of Sudan about this, and I think has heard back that the government of Sudan is not using that airstrip anymore for military purposes. But I suggest that needs to be independently verified.
Okay. Senator Wilson, what do you want to see done here?
Well, I think that the whole issue of peace in Sudan is much broader than oil, although oil and water are two of the key components. What I found out when I was over there is that there is an attempt by the Africans themselves to bring peace to Sudan, and Canada's in a supporting role only. We're part of an international team. Canada is not going to bring peace to the Sudan. And although oil is central to it, it's not the only issue.
But do you see Talisman as being a block to peaceful potential over there right now?
I'd say no. I think it's certainly implicated in the sense that no company is going to operate in the country without the government giving its okay, which means complicity immediately. But apart from that, if Canada were out, I think France would move in, and if Talisman were ever going to sell, which I guess it isn't now that it's making profits.
But there's complicity, and then there's complicity. So how?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. So Georgette, how complicit is Talisman now in the fact that there's an ongoing war there?
Well, some would argue that the fact that some of their infrastructure and the facilities they built is being used in the war primarily against civilians, is a form of complicity for which some sort of liability and responsibility must attach. Some say simply being in business with a government that is a notorious human rights abuser and giving that government a sense of legitimacy and doing business with them is another form of complicity.
But is Senator Wilson right in that the second we leave, somebody else is in there right away?
I'm sure that will be the case.
I'd like to say also that one of the key issues in the war is the issue of whether Sudan will remain a united state, and it's whether it will be a secular state, which is anathema to Muslims, or whether it will be a theocratic state. That's, the relationship between religion and the state is a key issue between the North and the South.
Maybe since you've raised it here, Senator Wilson, we should go into this a little bit more. This is a horrible civil war which has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Well, no, more. 1 to 2 million dead, actually.
That's right.
Between North and South, different religions, different factions. Can you, fill us in a bit on this?
And also Arabs and Africans.
Yes.
So, there are a lot of disparities. Basically, I think it's a failure to share wealth and power. But what pleases me is that the African states see it as a regional problem. They've involved most of the African neighboring states now. Egypt has brought forth another initiative, which we hope will be rolled into the what they call the IGAD process, which is managed by Kenya and the neighboring states there. So they don't want to buy Western solutions for an African regional issue, and Canada supports those efforts financially.
But as Lloyd Axworthy's peace missionary in that area, if you like, are you on anybody's side in this thing? Are we supporting one side over the other? Should we be?
We're supporting the Africans who are trying to broker a peace agreement. It's not easy when you've had a civil war for a long time and there's no quick fix.
Okay. George, let me ask you this. We asked Talisman to be here tonight. They have declined our invitation to be here. However, editorials, all of the newspapers, you heard on the radio today as well, they're making the case. This is just a company. It's not a government. They don't have the same obligations to do what a government has to do. What's your take on that?
Well, it is true that under international law, it is certainly not clear what the legal obligations and liabilities are of companies, which are also called non-state actors. However, I would argue, and many would argue, that companies have an ethical obligation to respect human rights and to do business in a way that doesn't hurt people.
Do you think Talisman believes that?
I hope it would. It has signed on to this international code of ethics for Canadian companies.
You visit their website and they show you all the wonderful things they're doing in the country, right?
Yes.
Hospitals they're building and so on.
Yes, but on the other hand, that development, although very good, is small in comparison to the need there. And some would also argue it's very one-sided, and it's only being delivered to people who support the government of Sudan.
Lois Wilson, let me get you on that too. What is the obligation of Talisman in this situation? Is it the same as a government's, or are they just a company and their job is to make money?
Well, I think that the whole relationship between human rights and trade has never been sorted out by the Canadian government or the Canadian people, for that matter. And Talisman is only one example of that. But what I'd like to say also is we better not forget we also are bringing this matter before the Security Council of the United Nations, and we also have the Commission on Human Rights in Geneva, where the international community will come together. So it's not as though we're taking no initiatives.
Understood. Can you, Georgette, tell us, let's get into some of the recommendations that your report put forward. You say Talisman has got to acknowledge that it's in a business with a government that systematically abuses human rights. Are they prepared to acknowledge that?
To date, from what I read in the newspaper today, they have not acknowledged that, in fact, the government of Sudan is committing human rights violations. I also know that they still have not acknowledged that any of the incidents that we mention in the report actually happened. They still disagree or reject those factual conclusions that we made.
You want them to tell the government of Sudan as well that it disagrees with what it's doing.
Yes,
are they prepared to do that at all?
Yes, we do. I don't know if they're prepared to do that. I haven't heard them say that they are going to do that.
The foreign minister disappointed, our foreign minister disappointed a lot of people today by saying he wasn't going to bring sanctions in against this company. He's got the U.S. State Department upset with him. He's got church groups and other thoughtful people in this country upset that he's talked the talk, but he hasn't walked the walk in this case. You think he's made his final ruling on sanctions in this case?
I would hope not. However, in his statement yesterday, he did not say that he would revisit the issue of sanctions. But I would hope, and I'm sure human rights organizations would hope that should Talisman not do some of the things that the government suggests it do, that it would look again at the issue of sanctions or taking action in a number of other ways, because there are other pieces of legislation in Canada which the government and Talisman as shareholders may be able to use to get Talisman to ensure that it respects human rights obligations.
Senator Wilson, do you think will you have Lloyd Axworthy's ear on this? Have you told him you're disappointed that he didn't bring in sanctions?
No, I haven't told him that, because the people who want sanctions, I always ask them what kind of sanctions, what's possible, what are the legal instruments we have at our disposal. I'm quite sure if there are concrete suggestions about things that we might do, he would be open and he would revisit. But at the present time, they seem to have met a wall.
You think he's gone far enough?
As far as he can go at the present time. I don't think he's got a closed mind on the issue. But sanctions rolls easily off our tongues. What's meant exactly? What is possible? I mean, the sanctions against South Africa were internationally imposed. They were asked for by the people within the country. So what are we talking about when we call for sanctions in Sudan?
Senator, we're hearing a word used in this part of the world that you don't hear used very much anymore.
What's that?
Slavery. Can you paint us a picture of what kind of slavery is going on over there?
The word that is used over there is abductions. And my information was that there are two kinds of things going on. One is the kind of abductions that take place between the tribes in payment for a debt or so on, and that's been going on since time immemorial and will likely continue into the future. The more serious thing that's going on is some key people have now commercialized this whole thing and are making pots of money over it. And the government of Sudan is unwilling to prosecute them, that is, to make them criminally responsible. And I think at some point that has to happen.
Georgette, did you see evidence of slavery when you were there in December?
Yes, we did not see evidence of slavery ourselves, but we did meet with many people who were intimately involved with these issues. And yes, it's called abduction, but as we say in the report, at the end of the day, it's a question of semantics to some extent.
Right. But are people in this for life? They get abducted for life, and that's
some
for life?
People get abducted for life. Others are redeemed. Others are used to work. Others are women are used for sexual purposes.
Senator Wilson, you look like you want the last word on this. Go ahead.
Well, many young girls are put into forced marriages.
Yes.
There's an attempt to reunite children with their parents, but I was told there were some parents who've been looking for their children for 10 years.
Yes. That's true.
You sound like you've got your work cut out for you, Senator, in that part of the world.
I think so.
Thanks for coming in tonight to talk to us about it, both of you. Senator Wilson, Georgette Gagnon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Later on Studio 2, Ontario's Women's Institute. More than a century of public service.
Some of the comments made by the men at that time was, oh, well, let them have their meeting. They won't be able to carry on because they'll soon all be fighting and it will break up.
Up next, the Chinese refugees seeking freedom or a career in crime.
On every ship, there's going to be an X amount of people here coming here for the sole purpose of becoming a gang members.
If you look at the numbers we're looking at, I mean, it's a percentage of what happens at Pearson in a week, you know, but the story's gotten so much coverage simply because there's a dramatic shot for the media to take.
Built by immigrants. We pride ourselves on our reputation as a tolerant, welcoming country. But that tolerance was sorely tested last summer when several boatloads of illegal immigrants from China began turning up on BC's shores. Canadian talk radio went crazy. One group particularly concerned about how to handle the boat people is the Chinese Canadian community. Now firmly entrenched in mainstream society, Canadians of Chinese descent are divided about the new arrivals. Year of the Dragon. In February, Chinese Canadians celebrate the New Year, a time known for luck, prosperity, and goodwill. But that fortune is not shared by many of the world's billion Chinese. Recently, hundreds have fled China's poor, rural Fujian province, willing to risk death aboard rusting ships and in squalid cargo containers for the chance at a better life in North America, the place they call the Golden Mountain.
What motivates somebody to get into the dark, dank, disgusting hull of a ship with not enough food, not enough water, no daylight for weeks maybe, and take that kind of a risk?
They want to get away. Why did the Irish come? You know, Angela's ashes, all that kind of stuff.
What are they escaping?
Poverty, extreme poverty, and the concept that that North America is land of Canada, United States, is land of freedom.
When they began turning up on Canadian shores, they ignited a fierce debate.
I don't think the majority of people in the community, nor mainstream Canadians, would view them as victims. They were not forced to take the voyage. They willingly paid the money, or at least paid a down payment, and agreed to work off the balance.
We should not see these people as criminals or somehow they are at fault, and we should treat them as the same way we treat anybody else who comes through the system.
How do you think the debate is playing out within the Chinese Canadian community?
Unfortunately, I think that many of us, the members of our community, are buying into the stereotypes and the fear-mongering that is being portrayed by the mainstream media in some instances.
And when they come to Canada, almost 40% of Chinese immigrants end up in Toronto, settling in Markham and Scarborough and the downtown Chinatown. Almost 400,000 strong, they are the biggest minority group in the city. Up until the late 90s, most came from Hong Kong, but that's changing. Most now come from mainland China.
I think historically there has been some kind of regionalism going on. You also look at the Chinese media, which is controlled by and large by Cantonese-speaking Hong Kong immigrants. So they will try to portray the Fujianese as different from, the people who are here.
And maintain the existing.
We brought together 3 Chinese Canadians of different backgrounds to see what they thought.
We have to be very careful about giving a wrong message. Okay, you come here, as soon as you land here, you step your foot on, you just open your mouth and you make a refugee claim, and then you're safe in here. I think that we have to do something. Our government has to do something about it. We really have to tighten up the entry, the illegal entry.
Everybody came to Canada, they have a right to apply for convention refugee. Once they apply, their status is on pending. So if we send them back at this time, this against the law. So I think we shouldn't do that because, we're saying like illegal immigrant, they are breaking the law, but we break the law first. How can we do that?
I've been more concerned about how this story's been sensationalized, actually. If you look at the numbers we're looking at, I mean, it's a percentage of what happens at Pearson in a week, but the story's gotten so much coverage. And I think, simply because there's a dramatic shot for the media to take, a boatload of people perhaps in a cargo container.
Let's talk about the migrants themselves. Are they looking for simply economic betterment, or do you think there's some political persecution at work here as well?
I think it's kind of meaningless sometimes, to sort of draw the line on the sand. This is political, this is not. We should try to understand that the political economic system in China is such that these factors are very well integrated.
They're looking for a better life. God bless them. Everybody looks for a better life in economic terms. But the question is, as a receiving country, are we in a position to accept that? Should we accept that?
We do know for a fact that the so-called snakeheads who are arranging for these voyages do recruit people from mainland China with one thing in mind is for them to come over here to bolster the existing gang power in North America. So on every ship, there's going to be an X amount of people here coming here for the sole purpose of becoming gang members.
We've talked here already about immigrant crime as a problem, and you have had an experience with credit card theft in particular. How big a problem is this? How much has it penetrated the community?
What's happened in Chinatown is that the merchants have found, the restaurant owners in particular, have found that when they hired the Fujianese immigrants, I'll call them for now, that in fact they were copying the credit card numbers, giving them to somebody. A duplicate card is made, and they're used within 24 or 48 hours.
Credit manufacturing and fraudulent credit cards are still controlled by the more established Big Circle boys. They have been in Toronto for over 10 years. The new wave of migrants, we're talking about the people that are coming from the boats, they're still in the infant stage of setting up their gang base. I can assure you that the Big Circle boys are not going to give up their heroin trade that easily to the Fujianese gangs. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out when two gangs cannot agree with certain things, then it's going to be a war. It's going to be a turf war.
It's interesting that conservative elements, or more conservative elements of the Chinese community, have perhaps in their quest for respectability been echoing the same kind of concerns that perhaps we'd see out of the Reform Party.
I know that some people associate with the Fujianese with the gangs and stuff. I don't think that it's fair to do it. But it so happened that these 600 people is from Fujian. Maybe do you think it's fair to stigmatize your own?
We don't see too many. Even maybe a very little. They have breaking the law, things like that. Normally they're working hard. They do like their normal life. They work. They went to school or things like that.
So we make you immigration minister. What do you want to do about this?
What I would do is expedite the refugee termination process, detain them until the process is over, notwithstanding some criticism because of that. I would also do whatever was within my power to make sure the Chinese government understood how severely we view this.
I think that it's also important for Canadians to start paying more attention to the situation in China and start questioning why is it that people want to leave that country. If they are really doing well, they don't have to leave. And then hopefully the next step is, sort of asking our government to help China become a real democratic society.
Later on Studio 2, the Women's Institutes.
Start our meeting with the Ode and the Mary Stuart Column.
Ontario's first feminists.
In the beginning, they were interested in cookery, in nutrition, And from that came the spin-off on health and baby clinics in rural communities, immunizations in schools, and they just branched out and looked at the community as a whole and how could they make a difference.
Up next, the RSP season.
The way you sing, okay.
Are consumers skittish about mutual funds? Are you getting ready for retirement? Yes, it's that time of the year again. Time to pull out the charts, read the books, study the numbers, and choose where to invest your RSP money. The vast majority of Canadians wait until now to do anything about RSP investments. Then they scramble to squeak in under the February 28th deadline. So, as the deadline looms, the question is, what should you do? Joining us tonight, 13 days and counting, Ranga Chan of Chan Carmichael and Company, and an author of several books on personal investment. Gail Vaz-Oxlade, a columnist with the Globe and Mail and author of A Woman of Independent Means. And Richard Croft, a portfolio manager with the Croft Financial Group. Before we get started, Group, let us take a look at some of the numbers inside the RSP industry in Canada. Throughout the 1990s, an average of 31% of Canadians contributed regularly to their RSPs. But the amounts have changed dramatically. In 1991, Canadians contributed $16 billion. That number rose steadily over the next few years, reaching more than $26 billion in 95, and then hitting a high of more than $27 billion in 1997. But in the 1998 tax year, that's the last one for which figures are available, contributions dropped for the first time in a decade, landing at $26.6 billion. Now, what kind of RSP investments are people making? 20%, some of their money in bonds. 24%, stocks. 34%, RSP money in GICs or term deposits. But the majority of investment still going into mutual funds, where 2/3 of Canadians put their retirement money. In fact, Canadians have a total of $330 billion invested in mutual funds, about half of which is in RSPs. And you look at those numbers, Gail, and you are blown away, and yet the shine is off RSPs now, aren't they?
Yes, it is.
Why is that?
Well, in Canada, our savings rate has been in a steady decline. For the last 5 or 6 years, it's sort of just been going like this. And we're right now, the average Canadian is saving about 1/3 of what the average German or the average Japanese is saving. So we're at a rate of about 5%, which is pathetic because you can't possibly maintain your emergency fund, take care of your retirement planning.
Twice as high as the Americans, though, isn't it?
That would not surprise me at all. No. The fact is that North America as a whole is very consumer-oriented, far less concerned about making sure that they have some money put away just in case.
But this is a 40-year-old instrument, Richard, RSPs?
Well, yeah, they've been around certainly for a long time, and I would take take a flip side of that a little bit. I think we've had some very strong markets in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly in the United States. And I think if you take the value of what those markets have done and the savings rate together, I think a lot of people find that maybe they've got enough for retirement right now and they don't have to save so much. And that might be part of the issue here. And we always talk about the Japanese being great savers. Well, the Japanese are in 1.5% on a 30-year bond, which means they double their money about every 140 years. So, I mean, they have to save more if they're going to have the same lifestyle when they retire.
Pretty tough to be a financial investor in that kind of a situation.
The fact is, though, not all of us are saving. That would be all very well and good if everybody was doing that and participating in the markets. But to a large extent, the majority of Canadians, well over 60%, never participate in RSPs at all, which means that, they have nothing put away.
I can't pick up the paper these days without reading a different story, probably every day or every other day, Ranga, where you don't read about some 25-year-old whiz kid who's figured out, some niche in the new economy and doesn't want a financial advisor, thank you very much. They're going on the web, they're finding out all of how to do this by themselves, and they don't need RSPs, they want to do it themselves. Is that part of why the shine is off this investment?
I think in a sense, yes, Steve. I mean, there's no question the internet and the web is revolutionizing things in our economy and, in fact, in the world at large. What the web brings to people, of course, is information.
In the old days, I mean, information was in the hands of the brokers, financial planners, etc. But now when you click on any website or any decent website, you get tons and tons of information. And people certainly are looking at the web and sort of trying to figure out for themselves that they could do it cheaper. Now, sometimes that's a bit dangerous, but nevertheless, the web is truly revolutionizing things.
Mutual funds, though, for your money, still the place to go?
I think for the vast majority of people, absolutely mutual funds are the place to be in. For the simple reason, first of all, Steve, they give you instant diversification. Secondly, you don't have to decide which particular security you should buy or sell. That's done by a professional manager. So there are lots of advantages, but as I say, the two key ones are professional management and instant diversification.
Okay, we've got Paul Martin's budget coming out in a couple of weeks, and I know, look at you all three smile already, and I know you're all anticipating...
A tax cut.
Not just tax cuts. Talking to Mike Harris again? No. I know you're not just anticipating tax cuts. You're anticipating Paul Martin loosening up on the foreign content regulations. Now, what is it now? What do you hope he does? And why would it make a difference to the people watching this show?
It makes no difference to people watching the show because they can get all the foreign content they want with clone funds, index derivative funds, linked GICs. I mean, there's a number of ways they can get all the foreign content they want.
Well, he seems to think he's doing a big thing here by increasing the foreign content.
A big whoop about nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Is what it is.
Don't hold back. Tell me what you really think.
Yeah, don't sit on that fence. He'll raise it to 30%. He'll probably do it 2% a year for the next 10 years or 5 years. You know, that's what it'll be.
I wish he would just abolish it completely.
Absolutely.
Because if he were to do that, we as investors would benefit overnight. Reason, Steve, I mean, all these index funds, clone funds, etc., they are charging an extra 0.5 percentage point, which is understandable because they have to use derivatives, etc. But if they didn't have to do that, we would all get at least 0.5 percentage point in our pockets, and over time, that would certainly amount to a lot of change.
Now, just to add to that, I think this may be the year Canada does very well. Actually, we did much better than the U.S. last year. So, you know, we may be raising the foreign content, everybody rushing to clone funds, because that's been the biggest selling area this year. There's no question about that.
Can you just describe what a clone fund is for those who haven't heard about it?
Clone fund is where the mutual fund owns a basket of GIC, or guaranteed investment certificate, treasury bills. They have that. They swap the returns on that for a basket of stocks in the U.S. or the foreign market they want to be into. The manager picks the basket of stocks they want. They do a swap in terms of the rates of return with a broker in the States. Somebody like Morgan Stanley does a lot of this work. And so what the mutual fund looks like is a fund that's actually holding a GIC, but the returns on that GIC are actually the returns on this basket of stocks down here. And you pay for that. As Ranga says, you pay about 50 basis points.
Which is okay unless the Canadian dollar keeps going up.
Well, that's interesting. Like the Canadian dollar on a fund inside an RSP only impacts the actual positive or negative return of that fund, because don't forget, most of the assets are still in that treasury bill. That's a real tricky thing, and you get some very interesting things there. But
I think, Steve, you raised a good point on the Canadian dollar.
Absolutely.
There's no question. I mean, the great danger that I see is Canadians running into international funds, of course, as the Canadian dollar strengthens, and most of us expecting it to strengthen, perhaps not tomorrow, but over the next year or so, that will most definitely cut into your returns when you switch your money back into Canadian dollars. So it's ironic, as you say, that, I mean, here's a period where the Canadian stock market is doing extremely well, one of the best ones, in fact, of all the industrial economies, at least over the last 12 months. Now you're finding precisely the wrong time. Canadians are moving out of Canadian equity funds and into international funds.
Well, part of that,
big danger.
Part of why people are moving away from Canadian equities is not all equities in Canada are doing as stellarly as people like Nortel and BCE. And unfortunately, what's happening is our TSE 300 is being wildly skewed by the presence of these particular two companies. And so people are looking at the TSE 300 and saying, well, it's getting, this phenomenally great rate of return.
When in
but
fact,
the 3 or 4 stocks I'm holding that are Canadian aren't doing that.
But
so
Nortel
maybe what I
BCE.
need to do is I need to go abroad to get the kinds of return that the TSE 300 looks like it's promising.
So when Paul Martin gets up and makes this announcement that I'm increasing the foreign content, you're all going to yawn.
I think so.
But he's going to look for a huge bang for his buck on this,
well,
right?
What we've seen so far is a lot of noise about foreign content, when in fact only about 20% of RSP holders are even at the foreign content limit. So we're not even taking advantage of the 20% we do have.
Well, we are probably taking advantage of it. We're probably taking advantage of it with the derivative-based funds. I mean, they're probably there.
But those are sophisticated products, and not a lot of people even understand them.
To a point, you're right. But Paul Martin's tax cut, we'll be able to know a whole lot about Paul Martin's tax cut when you see all the bravado around the RSP increases. Because if that's the big issue, then the tax cut's going to be nothing.
That's right.
Let me ask you, Gail, about, I saw this statistic today, and I couldn't believe it. People are not contributing anything close to what they could be contributing.
No.
In fact, there is $242 billion in unused capacity.
That's right.
Why don't people contribute as much as they can?
Because we don't save. It comes back to this basic difference in the way we perceive how we need to manage our money and other people perceive it. You know, other countries see that saving is important. If you don't save, then you won't have later on. But we don't save in Canada. What we do is we spend. So for every dollar we put away, we're spending $5 or $6 or $7, usually on a credit card. So we're paying interest on top of it. The basic problem is our unwillingness to accept the fact that we have to save some of our money.
If we don't save, I don't think so. I mean, you've got a bit of a point they gave, but I mean, one of the main reasons why Canadians are not saving is, remember, the 90s was a horrific decade for us, at least for the vast majority of Canadians.
Only the first half. The second half saw our economy getting stronger and stronger.
Yes, certainly the economy was getting stronger. Certainly certain segments of the economy did very, very well, but a large section of Canadians, I mean, they were struggling to keep their head above water. And common sense tells you, as the longer that continued, they started to draw down their savings. And I agree that's a risk there, but that's actually, I think, one of the key reasons why our savings rate is very low, and it indeed is the case why savings rates are very low in the U.S. The danger, of course, is if the U.S. goes into a recession, or I shouldn't say a recession, if the U.S. stock market corrects, the big fear that the Americans have is, of course, that that's going to impact immediately on consumers because we don't have any savings, and that'll drag the U.S. economy down into a recession. And that is a fear.
It's what Greenspan is watching as well.
Absolutely.
Because one of the things that he's using to predict or to decide whether he's going to put his interest rates up or not is how much of that paper-based wealth is being used to leverage people into more consumer items. Things like bigger houses, things like bigger cars. So how much of paper-based wealth, which really isn't wealth until it's cashed in, is being used to borrow for the future.
Speaking of which, do you want to tell people, do you want to suggest to people in these relatively buoyant times that if they have unused capacity for contribution, they should go out and borrow the money to put it in?
No, I wouldn't. I would take the other side of all of this. I saw an interesting statistic. I do some consulting with a couple of large insurance companies, and I saw some interesting statistics on their RIF payouts. 60% of the people, particularly one company that I've been with for about 4 years, about 60% of the people drawing on RIFs wish they didn't have to take the minimum. And I found that fascinating. That's a fascinating statistic to me. Because what it's doing is it's pushing them into a higher tax bracket, and they're getting taxed at a 70% level because they're getting clawed back on the old age security and all the other pieces of the puzzle. I mean, let's not forget what an RSP is, a tax deferral mechanism.
Right.
And if you're 55, 60 years of age, you get 9 to 14 years of tax deferral. Now, there's a question of how much advantage there is to that if at the end of that cycle it's coming out at the same tax rate it went in at.
Well, there's no point, obviously, if it's coming out at the same rate. The idea is coming out.
Except for the compounding growth, because it'll grow dramatically faster on a tax-deferred basis in an RSP than outside.
Normal middle-class folks, you want to tell them to borrow money to fill up their RSP space?
I would never say such a thing. What I would say instead is, let's pretend you borrowed the money and you were making regular monthly payments. Put that money into your RSP as much as you can afford and catch your RSP up that way. But why pay interest?
Even if it's $100 a month, put it in anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. It was $25 a month.
Okay. Let's talk about, where will I go here? Let's talk about Canada versus the world in terms of where to invest money. We're supposed to be doing better next year. Canada, as a country, better vis-a-vis the United States, maybe not better compared to Asia. You want to weigh in on that and say how we're doing?
I mean, in terms of economic growth, the Americans are still going to do well this year. We definitely think for both the United States and Canada there is going to be a slowdown taking place. Having said that, Steve, it's like going from about 4 to 4.5% down to about 3.5% or so. But the key here, it's a policy-mandated slowdown. As Gail was saying, the Federal Reserve, raising interest rates in order to try and cool the economy down because they don't have a breakout of inflation. So that's what's happening in North America. We're expecting a slowdown in the year 2000 and 2001. Opposite is taking place in Europe. Europe growth last year was about 2%. This year we think growth is going to be about 3%.
So if you're looking at instruments, what areas of the world ought you to be looking at?
Well, I think, first of all, investors should have a well-diversified portfolio. I know it's motherhood, but it really makes a lot of sense. Don't ignore Canada, because Canada is going to do well as well. But you need to have some money in Europe. You need to have some money, a little bit of money in Asia and Latin America. Both those regions are bouncing back dramatically, particularly Asia. And who would have thought just 2 years ago, and we had written off Asia.
Not me.
And now, no, that's true, not you. And now you find that South Korea, for instance, last year posted a rate of growth of 9%. And 6 months before the numbers came out, every pundit was saying that South Korea was going to continue to contract. So a lot of growth is taking place, and what it tells me, though, is be diversified. But again, I do want to bring this whole point about currency. If you're going to invest internationally, don't forget the currency impact. If the Canadian dollar strengthens, that will cut into returns.
Sure.
There are some studies out there, too, and just to follow up on that point, if you get beyond 35% foreign content, you run into the issue where the currency risk will have as much impact on the portfolio as the performance of the foreign market. So it's a very big issue.
Can I ask you what you're doing with your dough this time of year?
Well,
more than any of us.
I've held with Asia. I kept buying Asia when Asia was...
Even when everybody was panicking, you hung in there.
Absolutely. And, some of the best advisors that I have kept saying to me, well, Asia's not going to do anything. You should probably get out of Asia. And I kept saying, well, this would seem to be the time to buy. And I've been holding a mutual fund. I was holding Trimark Asia Pacific, which holds some India. And it did awfully for the longest time. And now it's like it's just going through the roof.
Coming back.
So, as Rega said, I believe that if you look to the opportunities in Europe, Asia, and Latin America, and balance yourself up and probably not go over the 30%, then you're probably going to be fine.
Let's do this in our last couple of minutes here. Just give some people some basic advice. We are being bombarded. You can't turn on the radio, the television set. You can't walk into your bank. You can't call. You can't do phone banking without first having to get through a commercial about where to put your RSP dough. Okay? Ranga, give people some advice. What do you want?
I think when it comes to ads, etc., honestly, ignore it. Ignore all the noise out there, because remember, companies understandably are in the business of selling and promoting their products, and that's just going to confuse investors. Don't do rear view investing either. I mean, when you're looking at the ads that appear in the newspapers, they will say a particular fund delivered 100%. Well, that's yesterday's money.
What are you going to do? What have you done for me lately?
Exactly. Right. I think certain rules of thumb that people should follow. One, have a decent financial plan. It's amazing, Steve, the vast majority of Canadians don't have a plan. You need a plan because that's your roadmap as to where you're trying to get to. Secondly, when it comes to mutual funds, pick funds with good track records, but do pay close attention to management expenses.
There is a sense, Richard, that if you haven't been putting money away since you were 20 years old, that once you're 35 or 40, it's too late. You're going to be poor when you're old. Do you know what I mean?
No, I don't believe that. I do think, though, that maybe...
But that's the pressure banks put on you to get in early.
It is, and I think it's a mistake. But I will say that I think that we sort of have the risk spectrum on investors wrong. I think the individual who's 25 probably should take less risks than the person who's 80. And I think it's just to make a mistake at age 25, if somebody just did some of those compound calculations for the next 40 years, the cost of that mistake is dramatic. To me, the person that can take a risk is the 75-year-old who's got more money than they need, and they want to go take $20,000 and buy pork bellies, go ahead. So I think, they ought to take a hard look at risk. I think they ought to have a diversified portfolio. I would be aware of the 35% and over foreign content and the currency issues around that.
You guys are great. Thanks for the advice. Up next, Women's Institutes, a rural tradition in Ontario.
I do believe we have been a feminist group. It's just that we've been quietly going about it, and I guess we're doers, not talkers.
Call them Canada's first feminists. No, we're not talking about NAC, the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. It's another Canadian group that's been around a lot longer. The Women's Institutes is an organization for rural women, and this weekend it celebrates its 103rd anniversary. It all started in Stony Creek, Ontario, and now has millions of members in 70 countries around the world. Still, many people have no idea the group even exists. We spent a day with members of the Coningsby branch. That's a chapter near Guelph, to find out what the Women's Institutes are all about.
And now we go back, we form the core of the flower, right? Now we'll start to roll.
The very first Women's Institute meeting was held at Stony Creek on February the 19th in 1897.
Stitch it together, yes.
Adelaide Hoodless lost a child to the fact that milk was unpasteurized, and she took on the cause that she should teach women about good nutrition, and so she started a Women's Institute branch with the idea of teaching them good homemaking practices and good health.
Ring your little bell.
Ring my little bell. Okay, I'll ring my little bell. I'd like to welcome the Hillsburg Auxiliary ladies and also any other guests and Pat Salter. And we will start our meeting with the ode and the Mary Stuart Collect.
It probably was a radical idea, yes. Some of the comments made by the men recorded in history at that time was, oh, well, let them have their meeting. They won't be able to carry on because they'll soon all be fighting and it will break up. It didn't break up.
If you belonged to Women's Institute, you were covered by this health insurance that before OHIP was in. And so all rural women wanted to belong to that. And that was when the membership was really the highest. About 35,000 members during the war, of course. They helped a lot with the war effort, with knitting and all kinds of things. So that was a big time for membership, too, because also, women needed the support of each other if their husbands were away.
So it's your own creation, okay?
Oh, yes, I see how it's coming into place now.
Yes? And you see the beautiful colors at the center then?
Beautiful.
I think in the beginning, they were interested in cookery, in nutrition, and in menu planning. And from that came the spin-off on health, which then led into, baby clinics in rural communities, immunizations in schools, and they just branched out and looked at the community as a whole and how could they make a difference there.
We survive on our membership, which is $18.15 a year. In Ontario, we have 12,000 members in 800 branches, from Northern Ontario to Southern Ontario to east to west.
Grant that we may realize that it is the little things that create differences.
Rural women need an organization of their own because their circumstances are a little different from women who live in cities and have access to government programs, community programs there. In the country, when the Women's Institute began, those things weren't available.
You want one or two? I'll start with one, okay? I think the sociability of the rural organization is important because, your neighbor isn't right next door. You don't run next door and borrow a cup of sugar, like you do in the city. And I think it was an opportunity for the neighbors to get together socially as well as share their learning experiences.
Myrtle, I need your expertise again.
A lot of times when you meet up with somebody and they say, oh, Women's Institute, what is that?
The difference between the Women's Institute and NAC and other feminist groups, and it's my personal belief, but I do believe we have been a feminist group. It's just that we've been quietly going about it, and I guess we're doers, not talkers, and so we've just gone about our work and hoping that we can make communities better, more livable, and safer for all people who are there. And we just haven't talked about it. We've been terrible public relations officers for our own organization.
It was because of Women's Institute that music was taught in the schools, the same with home economics. They also campaigned for white lines on the road and stop signs on the school buses. They campaigned to have bread wrapped when there wasn't any plastic bags. If it happened, there was an accident in your community, right away we banded together. How are you going to fix this? Does it need a stop sign? Does it need a traffic light? Let's get to the municipal level, and if they can't help us, we'll move above. And we still provide 4 scholarships for students at Guelph University that are in family studies.
We're looking especially at women's health. It hasn't been done until the last number of years, and the Women's Institute was one of the leaders in that. Osteoporosis, breast cancer, all cancers as they affect women, heart and stroke, which has quite a different connotation for women than for men. And another thing in which we're involved right now is working with pharmaceutical companies to give information to women in the rural communities, many of whom are shut in.
Now we'll have our roll call. What year did you join the Institute, and who invited you?
I joined in 1944, and it was Selma Gray's sister, Jean, that made me join.
Well, I joined the Coningsby Institute in 1950 when we lived on the 6th line, and Mrs. Herb Beatty was the one that invited me to join.
In 1929. Who invited you? I don't know.
Coningsby branch started up in 1905. Obviously, I wasn't here then.
We went sleigh riding on a hill on 27th Side Road at noon. You'll not believe it, but I have a picture taken about 1922 of the 17 pupils, and 15 of us are in bare feet.
The oldest member of each institute was to write a grandmother's legacy. Then we are all to do our grandmother's legacy, and there are different portions that we should include. And I was the one that said that you should put in how many monarchs you have seen, because a lot of children maybe won't see any. It would certainly be nice to be able to attract younger women, but so many younger women work. Most of our meetings are in the afternoon because some of our members don't want to drive at night. Therefore, it usually happens that as women retire, they join the Institute.
We've had about 350 new members last year over Ontario, which is, you know, it's not a great deal. But I think that we'll catch up with these people eventually when their lifestyle slows down a little bit. I feel confident that Women's Institute will go on for another 100 years.
Thursday night on Studio 2, A Night at the Opera with Michael Colvin. Michael Colvin, the rising star of Canadian opera, Thursday night on Studio 2. Heading down to Queen's Park tomorrow afternoon, where finally, 10 years later, former Premier David Peterson is having his portrait unveiled at Queen's Park. You know, every former Premier, Jerry's got to get their portrait. And I bumped into him last week. He said, "You are coming to Queen's Park for the hanging, aren't you?" And I think I knew what he meant. Anyway, we're going to have a camera down there, and we will show you. The Premier says, former Premier, that this portrait is unlike any other former Premier there. So naturally, we have to go, we have to see, and we'll have it on the air for you Friday night. That's it for us tonight. So long, everybody. Tomorrow at 8.